Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. The 7th Safer Gambling Conference, organized by the National Betting Authority, will begin in 5 minutes.
Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. The 7th Safer Gambling Conference, organized by the National Betting Authority, is about to begin. Before the official start of the conference, we would like to briefly draw your attention to a few operational matters in order to ensure the smooth running of the event. First, please make sure that your mobile phone is switched to silent mode. You will find a QR code in front of you, which you can scan to access the agenda of the conference. For free internet access, simply connect to the open wireless network under the name Hilton Honors Meeting. For any further information or assistance that you may require during the conference, please don't hesitate to contact the IMH Secretariat outside. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the conference's chair, Joerg Hofmann, partner at MELCHERS law firm in Germany.
Kalimera, and good morning, and welcome, or even welcome back to this wonderful conference in this wonderful country. My name is Joerg Hofmann, and I have the pleasure to guide you to today's program and agenda. For me, it's the 5th time that I attend this conference, and I love it. It's a permanent fixture in my calendar, and I can tell you why. It's a conference just focusing on responsible gaming, on player protection. Player protection is the main goal of regulation when it comes to gaming. It's most important, and it's omnipresent. When I went to the old town, city, last night, I even saw billboards, like a symbolic sign that player protection and responsible gaming, it's not just limited to discussions in a room, it's outside, it's everywhere, and it's cross-border, it's international. The value of this conference is that it brings together leading expertise, brilliant people, not only to discuss, but to share insights about developments, about what's next, what can be improved, and what is most important to protect the players. That's why we are all here. That's why we're coming back almost every year. So welcome back to those who have been here before, and I'm looking forward to meet those people who are here for the very first, but not for the last time. I have to give you some few announcements. First, quite important, is that you can share your interest with the panelists. There will be presenters giving some presentations. We will have a couple of panel discussions, and you might have questions or comments. If you do have questions, please make use of the Slido app. You can see this here. All you need to do is scan the QR code or access the Slido site. Then you will find on your screen the main page of Slido. Slido is a very nice tool to submit your questions to the audience and to the moderators and speakers. You need a password, and that's easy. It's SGW, like Safer Gambling Week, SGW 2024 for this year. I suppose next year it will be 2025, but you have to count to make sure that is correct. So if you have questions for Slido, please make sure you send them to us, and we're happy to answer these questions as best as we can. So now I don't want to waste time because we want to focus, we want to look at the interesting speeches and presentations. And before we start with presentations and panels, I'm happy to introduce two speakers for welcome presentations. At first, because ladies first, it's a pleasure to welcome Mrs. Christina Christoforou on behalf of the National Betting Authority, which is the host and organizer of this format today. She is the head of Safer Gambling and Business Development Directorate. Christina, would you please come over and let us know what you have.
αρχής, την προστασία του κοινού και ειδικότερα των ατόμων να αναγνωρίσουμε τυχόν επιβλαβείς συνέπειες και να αναζητήσουμε υποστήριξη. Η φετινή μας θεματική, ασφάλεια, ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι, αναδεικνύει τη σημασία της ασφάλειας στα τυχερά παιχνίδια και τονίζουμε τη σημαντικότητα της ύπαρξης ενός προστατευτικού περιβάλλοντος και της συμμετοχής όλων των εμπλεκόμενων μερών σε αυτήν την προσπάθεια. Μέσα από τις δράσεις που θα πραγματοποιηθούν κατά τη διάρκεια της εβδομάδας, η αρχή επιχειρεί να ενημερώσει, να ευαισθητοποιήσει και παράλληλα να εμπλέξει και να κινητοποιήσει το ευρύτερο κοινωνικό σύνολο στην προώθηση του ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού και της προστασίας του κοινού. Η 7η εβδομάδα περιλαμβάνει πολυεπίπεδες δράσεις, εκδηλώσεις, εκπαιδευτικά σεμινάρια, βιωματικά εργαστήρια και διαδραστικά παιχνίδια. Εδώ και 7 χρόνια, μέσα από ποικίλες δράσεις, στοχεύσαμε στην εξάλειψη του στίγματος που συνόδευε την ενασχόληση με τα τυχερά παιχνίδια και δει την προβληματική. Μέσα από συνεχείς προσπάθειες, την αποτελεσματική ρύθμιση και εποπτεία του τομέα, την αντιμετώπιση προκλήσεων, αλλά και τις κατάλληλες συνέργειες, πετύχαμε στο να αποστιγματιστεί σε μεγάλο βαθμό η προβληματική συμπεριφορά. Οι παίχτες πλέον μπορούν πιο εύκολα να μοιραστούν τους προβληματισμούς τους και να ζητήσουν βοήθεια, εκεί όπου χρειάζεται, χωρίς να έχουν το φόβο και αστιγματισμό από την κοινωνία. Αυτό εξάλλου επιβάλλει και η στρατηγική ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού της αρχής. Να προστατεύσουμε την κοινωνία από τις επιβλαβείς συνέπειες του στοιχήματος και των τυχερών παιχνιδιών, να δώσουμε κίνητρα στα εμπλεκόμενα μέρη για συνεργασία στην υλοποίηση μέτρων προστασίας της δημόσιας υγείας, αλλά και να δημιουργήσουμε ευαισθητικό περιβάλλον για τους παίχτες. Ακόμα σημαντικότερο είναι να προλάβουμε. Η πρόληψη θα έρθει μέσα από τη μεγαλύτερη ευαισθητοποίηση του κοινού, την εφαρμογή πρακτικών ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού και την παροχή πόρων και υποστήριξης. Να βοηθήσουμε επίσης όσους έχουν ξεπεράσει τα όρια, με παροχή υποστήριξης σε όσα άτομα τη χρειάζονται, με στόχο τη βελτίωση της υγείας και της ευημερίας τους και την ενίσχυση της θεραπείας και μείωση του στίγματος. Να αναπτύσσουμε προγράμματα, πολιτικές και να λαμβάνουμε πρωτοβουλίες οι οποίες ενισχύουν την ασφάλεια και τη δημόσια υγεία, δίνοντας προτεραιότητα στην υποστήριξη της έρευνας για το στοίχημα και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Κυρίες και κύριοι, με την πλήρη εφαρμογή των κανονισμών προστασίας των παιχτών από τους εποπτευόμενους μας, είδαμε τα μέτρα αυτοπροστασίας που θέτουν οι παίχτες να αυξάνονται κατακόρυφα, φτάνοντας στο 205% από τον πρώτο χρόνο που τέθηκαν σε εφαρμογή, δηλαδή την περίοδο 2022-2023. Ενώ με την εφαρμογή των κανονισμών καταφέραμε το 100% των παιχτών να θέσει έστω και ένα μέτρο αυτοπροστασίας. Σίγουρα, οι κανονισμοί είναι δυναμικοί, ούτως ώστε να λαμβάνουν υπόψη τις τελευταίες εξελίξεις σε παγκόσμιο επίπεδο, ιδιαίτερα τη χρήση των νέων τεχνολογιών, όπως της τεχνολογίας AI, για περαιτέρω προστασία των παιχτών. Είμαστε ιδιαίτερα περήφανοι για την επίτευξη της λειτουργίας της Εθνικής Πλατφόρμας Αυτοαποκλεισμού από τον Φεβρουάριο του 2024. Είναι ένα σημαντικό εργαλείο στα χέρια των παιχτών για καλύτερη διαχείριση της ενασχόλησης τους με το στοίχημα, αφού έχουν την ευκαιρία να αυτοαποκλειστούν από όλες τις εταιρείες διαδικτυακής παροχής υπηρεσιών στοιχήματος. Η ανταπόκριση των παιχτών ξεπέρασε κάθε προσδοκία, αφού μέχρι σήμερα είναι εγγεγραμμένα πέρα των 150 άτομα. Από αυτούς, οι 68 έχουν θέσει ενεργό αυτοαποκλεισμό, με τους 54 να έχουν θέσει επαόριστον αποκλεισμό. Στόχος μας, βέβαια, είναι η συνεχής εξέλιξή της, καθώς είμαστε στη διαδικασία ένταξης της πλατφόρμας και συγκεκριμένων ομάδων πληθυσμού, όπως οι λήπτες επιδομάτων, οι αθλητές και άλλοι. Στο πλαίσιο της διαμόρφωσης πολιτικών για ενίσχυση ενός ασφαλούς περιβάλλοντος για τους παίχτες, είναι η πρωτοβουλία της αρχής για την υιοθέτηση του Safer Gambling Standard σε ευρωπαϊκό επίπεδο. Η διαδικασία είναι σε εξέλιξη και αναμένουμε να ξεκινήσει η συζήτηση στη σχετική επιτροπή ΣΕΝ. Η προσπάθειά μας επικεντρώνεται στο να βελτιώνουμε διαρκώς το ρυθμιστικό πλαίσιο των εταιριών και πρωτίστως να ενισχύουμε την ασφάλεια των παιχτών. Κυρίες και κύριοι, Η επόμενη σημαντική επιδίωξη της στρατηγικής μας είναι η πρόληψη, χρησιμοποιώντας 3 επίπεδα, καθολική, επικεντρωμένη και στοχευμένη, για πρόληψη και μείωση των επιβλαβών συνεπειών σε όλα τα επίπεδα κινδύνου του στοιχήματος και των τυχερών παιχνιδιών. Το προηγούμενο διάστημα προχωρήσαμε στην ενίσχυση υφιστάμενων δράσεων αλλά και στην υλοποίηση νέων πρωτοβουλειών με τη σύναψη στρατηγικών συνεργασιών με φορείς του δημόσιου και ιδιωτικού τομέα. Συνεχίσαμε για 3η συνεχή χρονιά την υλοποίηση του προγράμματος Young Cities, ένα πρόγραμμα έμμεσης πρόληψης σε συνεργασία με τον Οργανισμό Νεολαίας Κύπρου, στοχεύοντας την κάλυψη 24 δήμων και κοινοτήτων μέχρι το τέλος του 2025. Το πρόγραμμα αποσκοπεί στη δημιουργία νεανικών πόλεων μέσα από την ανάπτυξη και υλοποίηση προτάσεων με πολλαπλασιαστικό αντίκτυπο, καθώς και την καλλιέργεια σύγχρονων δεξιοτήτων στους νέους. Απόδειξη της επιδραστικότητας που έχει το πρόγραμμα είναι και η πρόσφατη βράβευσή του με το Good Practice Certificate στα European Public Sector Awards 2023-2024 στην κατηγορία Innovation in Public Administration. Παράλληλα, υλοποιούμε καθ' όλη τη διάρκεια του έτους ενημερωτικές εκστρατείες για το κοινό με στόχο τη διαφώτισή του σε θέματα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού. Ένα βασικό μέρος της στρατηγικής μας είναι η προστασία των ανήλικων προσώπων. Για την ενίσχυση της προστασίας τους και τη μείωση της ευαλωτότητάς τους, προχωρήσαμε το προηγούμενο διάστημα σε συνεργασία με το Μουσείο του Παραμυθιού, το πρόγραμμα Alliance for Children and Youth και τη διαδραστική έκθεση συναισθημάτων με τίτλο «Τι μας λένε τα συναισθήματα». Το πρόγραμμα αποτελεί μια ολιστική παρέμβαση για παιδιά, εφήβους και τις οικογένειές τους, με ομάδες ανάπτυξης γονεϊκών δεξιοτήτων, ομάδες ανάπτυξης κοινωνικών δεξιοτήτων για παιδιά και εφήβους, ατομική θεραπεία εφήβων, οικογενειακή θεραπεία και θεραπεία ζευγαριών. Στόχος του προγράμματος είναι η ανάπτυξη της ψυχικής ανθεκτικότητάς τους, η ενδυνάμωση των οικογενειακών συστημάτων και η ανάπτυξη ενός οικογενειακού κλίματος που προάγει τη ψυχική υγεία των παιδιών και των εφήβων. Η χρήση διαδραστικών παιχνιδιών αποδείχτηκε αποτελεσματική. Γι' αυτό στοχεύουμε εκ νέου στην υλοποίηση του παιχνιδιού Game Brain σε σχολεία ανά το Παγκύπριο. Μέσα από 5 διαφορετικά παιχνίδια, οι μαθητές ενημερώνονται για τους κινδύνους της προβληματικής ενασχόλησης, το ρίσκο και τους τρόπους υποστήριξης. Ευελπιστούμε στη θετική ανταπόκριση του Υπουργείου Παιδείας για την ενδυνάμωση των μαθητών μας. Φέτος, ενισχύουμε περαιτέρω τις συνεργασίες μας για ενίσχυση της ψυχικής ανθεκτικότητας των ανηλίκων, αφού έχουμε συνάψει μνημόνιο συνεργασίας με το Κέντρο Θεάτρου για παιδιά και νεαρά άτομα Ασίτες Cyprus και ήδη συμμετέχουμε στο πρώτο Διεθνές Φεστιβάλ Παραστατικών Τεχνών για παιδιά και νεαρά άτομα και θα υλοποιήσουμε περαιτέρω δράσεις σε συνεργασία το επόμενο χρονικό διάστημα. Με την ολοκλήρωση της Παγκύπριας Έρευνας Επιπολασμού των Ανηλίκων, αξιολογούμε τα αποτελέσματά της, τα οποία θα καθοδηγήσουν τις δράσεις και τις ενέργειές μας για περαιτέρω προστασία αυτής της ομάδας στόχου. Είναι σημαντικό όμως να υπογραμμίσουμε τον αδιαμφισβήτητο ρόλο των γονιών στην πρόληψη της προβληματικής συμπεριφοράς στους ανηλίκους. Το επόμενο χρονικό διάστημα θα προχωρήσουμε στην υλοποίηση προγράμματος ενδυνάμωσης γονεϊκών δεξιοτήτων σε συνεργασία με την Αρχή Εξαρτήσεων. Μέσα από στοχευμένες πρωτοβουλίες όπως το πρόγραμμα Γυναίκες και τυχερά παιχνίδια, ενδυναμώνουμε τις γυναίκες, γεφυρώνουμε το χάσμα. Σε συνεργασία με την Αρχή Εξαρτήσεων και τον ΣΠΑΒΟ, έχουμε δώσει ιδιαίτερη προσοχή στα ιδιαίτερα χαρακτηριστικά της συμμετοχής των γυναικών στα τυχερά παιχνίδια και τις επιπτώσεις που μπορεί να έχουν αυτές οι δραστηριότητες στη ψυχολογία και την καθημερινή ζωή τους. Τα ευρήματα από τις έρευνές μας δείχνουν ότι πολλές γυναίκες βιώνουν επιπτώσεις από την ενασχόληση με τα τυχερά παιχνίδια και με αυτό το πρόγραμμα στόχος μας είναι να προσφέρουμε πρακτικά εργαλεία και δράσεις για την έγκαιρη παρέμβαση και εντοπισμό των ευάλωτων γυναικών και την παραπομπή τους στις αρμόδιες υπηρεσίες της Δημοκρατίας. Το πρόγραμμα θα εμπλουτιστεί το επόμενο διάστημα και στόχος μας είναι η καθολική εφαρμογή του σε άλλες υπηρεσίες και δομές. Έχοντας ως στόχο την περαιτέρω προστασία του κοινωνικού συνόλου, ενισχύουμε τις συνέργειές μας. Είμαστε σε επικοινωνία με τον Κυπριακό Σύνδεσμο Διεύθυνσης Ανθρώπινου Δυναμικού για την ενίσχυση της ψυχικής υγείας των εργαζομένων. Αυτό θα επιτευχθεί μέσω διαδραστικών εργαστηρίων στα τμήματα HR των εταιριών. Πέραν από τις δράσεις προστασίας και πρόληψης, είναι σημαντική και η υποστήριξη των ατόμων που επηρεάζονται από τις επιβλαβείς συνέπειες. Στόχος μας είναι η ενίσχυση και η υποστήριξη της θεραπείας και η μείωση του στίγματος για τη βελτίωση της προσβασιμότητας σε θεραπευτικές δομές. Έτσι, σε συνεργασία με την Αρχή Εξαρτήσεων, προχωρήσαμε στη λειτουργία των θεραπευτικών κέντρων με ονομασία Κίνητρο στις επαρχίες Αμοχώστου και Πάφου, τα οποία απευθύνονται σε ενήλικες οι οποίοι παρουσιάζουν προβληματική ή παθολογική συμπεριφορά σε σχέση με τα τυχερά παιχνίδια, καθώς επίσης και για τα μέλη της οικογένειάς τους. Είναι σημαντικό να αναφερθεί ότι επιδιώκουμε όλες οι ενέργειες και οι πρωτοβουλίες μας να βασίζονται σε εμπεριστατωμένες έρευνες, δεδομένα και στατιστικά στοιχεία, με στόχο να καταγράφουμε τις διάφορες τάσεις του τομέα και τις αντιλήψεις του κοινού, σύμφωνα και με την τέταρτη στρατηγική μας επιδίωξη, η οποία αφορά την υποστήριξη της έρευνας. Κυρίες και κύριοι, η βιωσιμότητα του τομέα και η προστασία των παιχτών θα πρέπει να θωρακιστούν περαιτέρω με νομοθετικές ρυθμίσεις. Περί τα μέσα Σεπτεμβρίου καταθέσαμε ενώπιον του Υπουργού Οικονομικών αναθεωρημένο νομοσχέδιο, με το οποίο θα εξασφαλίζεται η επαρκής προστασία των παιχτών, με έμφαση στους ανηλίκους και άλλες ευάλωτες ομάδες, ενώ παράλληλα θα ενισχύει τη βιώσιμη ανάπτυξη του τομέα και επιπλέον επιδιώκει την καθιέρωση της δημοκρατίας ως ένα κέντρο ανάπτυξης και καινοτομίας. Ενδεικτικά, το νομοσχέδιο περιλαμβάνει πρόνοιες για την πλήρη ρύθμιση της αγοράς των τυχερών παιχνιδιών, εξαιρουμένων των υπηρεσιών που βρίσκονται σε καθεστώς μονοπωλίου. Επί τούτου, εξίζει να αναφερθεί ότι σύμφωνα με την Παγκύπρια Ποσοτική Έρευνα Επιπολασμού της Αρχής, το ποσοστό ενασχόλησης με τις υπηρεσίες που βρίσκονται σήμερα σε καθεστώς παρανομίας ανέρχεται στο 25% των παιχτών και 14% του γενικού πληθυσμού. Επιπρόσθετα, το νομοσχέδιο περιλαμβάνει πρόνοιες για την αύξηση της ασφάλειας των παιχτών με μία σειρά από μέτρα και διατάξεις που αντανακλούν τις βέλτιστες πρακτικές του τομέα, όπως τον αυτόματο αποκλεισμό όσων έχουν διαγνωστεί με διαταραχή ενασχόλησης με τα τυχερά παιχνίδια, financial blocking σε παράνομες υπηρεσίες, απαγόρευση χρήση πιστωτικών καρτών και την υποχρέωση θέσπισης πολιτικής, στόχων και δικτών απόδοσης σε σχέση με το ασφαλές παιχνίδι. Περαιτέρω, σημαντική καινοτομία του νομοσχεδίου αποτελεί η θεσμοθέτηση του λειτουργού ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού. Στην περαιτέρω θωράκιση των ανηλίκων μέσω της καθιέρωσης της ευθύνης γονέα και κηδεμόνα, σε περιπτώσεις όπου ο ανήλικος συμμετέχει σε τυχερό παιχνίδι, ανεξαρτήτως εάν ο γονέας είχε γνώση, ανέχθηκε ή επέτρεψε τη συμμετοχή αυτή. Στις περιπτώσεις αυτές, θα επιβάλλεται εξώδικο πρόστιμο στο γονέα κηδεμόνα, ενώ εάν ο ανήλικος είναι πάνω των 15 ετών, θα επιβάλλεται πρόστιμο και σε αυτόν. Συνεπώς, η εφαρμογή ενός αναθεωρημένου νομοθετικού πλαισίου θα επιφέρει πολυεπίπεδα ωφέλη. Κυρίες και κύριοι, κλείνοντας, επιτρέψτε μου να ευχαριστήσω τους συνεργάτες στην Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων, το προσωπικό μας αλλά και τους εξωτερικούς μας συνεργάτες για την πολύτιμη συνεισφορά τους και για την άψογη διοργάνωση των επικείμενων δράσεων της 7ης Εβδομάδας Ασφαλούς Παιχνιδιού. Θα ήθελα επίσης να παρατείνω τις ευχαριστίες μας στην δέος Πρόεδρο της Αρχής, κυρία Ιωάννα Φιάκου, για την καθοριστική συμβολή και ηγεσία της τα τελευταία 9 χρόνια στην επιτεύξη των στρατηγικών επιδιώξεων και στην αποτελεσματική λειτουργία της Αρχής, καθώς και στην ανάπτυξη του τομέα. Ευχαριστούμε για τη συμμετοχή σας και σας ευχόμαστε να έχετε ένα επικοδομητικό συνέδριο.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Christoforou, for sharing your insights about latest development in Cyprus regulation and player protection measures. Thank you. I'm glad to welcome our next speaker. Regulation is part of our daily business, and the regulator applies the law. But the law goes back to what politicians think, what politicians drive and put on the road. So I'm very happy to welcome a representative from the Ministry of Finance. I'm happy to welcome Mr. Georg Panteli, who is the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Finance in Cyprus. It's an honor to have you here, sir, and the floor is yours. Would you please come up to the stage?
Thank you, Mr. Hofmann. Κυρίες και κύριοι, εκλεκτοί προσκεκλημένοι, με ιδιαίτερη χαρά ανταποκρίθηκα στην πρόσκληση της Εθνικής Αρχής Στοιχημάτων να απευθύνω χαιρετισμό στο Συνέδριο Ασφαλούς Παιχνιδιού, το οποίο σηματοδοτεί την έναρξη της 7ης Εβδομάδας Ασφαλούς Παιχνιδιού. Μια διοργάνωση η οποία έχει εξελιχθεί σε θεσμό, συμβάλλοντας αποφασιστικά στην ευαισθητοποίηση του κοινού για την προβληματική ενασχόληση με το στοίχημα και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια και προς την κατεύθυνση της καλλιέργειας κουλτούρας ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού. Όλοι όσοι βρίσκεστε εδώ έχετε ήδη γνώση για το γεγονός ότι ο τομέας του στοιχήματος και των τυχερών παιχνιδιών έχει γνωρίσει σημαντική ανάπτυξη τα τελευταία χρόνια, έχοντας μετεξελιχθεί σε πυλώνα ανάπτυξης της κυπριακής οικονομίας. Οι αριθμοί απολύτως ενδεικτικοί, καθώς μόνο το 2023 τα δημόσια έσοδα από τον τομέα των τυχερών παιχνιδιών και του στοιχήματος, συνυπολογίζοντας τα έσοδα από το καζίνο, το κρατικό λαχείο, τις λέξεις υποδρομιών και των ορισμένων τυχερών παιχνιδιών από τον ΟΠΑΠ, ως ποσοστό του καθάριστου χώρου προϊόντος ανήλθε στο 0,4%. Καθόλου ευκαταφρόνητο ποσοστό. Όπως είναι γνωστό, βασικός εταίρος της κυβέρνησης στον τομέα της στοιχηματικής δραστηριότητας είναι η Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Από αυτό εδώ το βήμα, αισθάνομαι την ανάγκη να συγχάρω θερμά την αρχή για το παρησίμαντο έργο που επιτελεί και για το γεγονός ότι ασκεί αποτελεσματικά τον πολυσχηδή ρόλο που της έχει ανατεθεί. Με τη δική της καθοριστική συμβολή, ο τομέας κατέγραψε πρωτοφανή ανάπτυξη την τελευταία δεκαετία σε ένα ρυθμιζόμενο περιβάλλον, χωρίς να κάνει την παραμικρή έπτωση σε θέματα ασφάλειας και προστασίας του κοινού και των ευάλωτων ομάδων και αποδίδοντας παράλληλα ιδιαίτερη σημασία στην καλλιέργεια κουλτούρας ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού. Ως αποτέλεσμα των προσπαθειών και της δράσης της αρχής, αυξήθηκαν σημαντικά τα έσοδα του κράτους, οι θέσεις εργασίας στον τομέα, ενώ την ίδια στιγμή έχει αποστιγματιστεί σε μεγάλο βαθμό η αναζήτηση βοήθειας για θέματα προβληματικής ενασχόλησης. Παράλληλα, η Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων φροντίζει διαρκώς για την αξιοποίηση των νέων δυνατοτήτων που προσφέρει η τεχνολογία και για την εφαρμογή νέων εργαλείων που θα τη βοηθήσουν να ασκήσει ακόμη καλύτερα και αποτελεσματικότερα το πολυεπίπεδο ρόλο της. Η Εθνική Πλατφόρμα Αυτοαποκλεισμού, που τέθηκε πρόσφατα σε λειτουργία, είναι ένα τέτοιο σημαντικό εργαλείο, αφού προσφέρει στους παίχτες την δυνατότητα να ελέγξουν τη στοιχηματική τους δραστηριότητα και να θέσουν τα όρια τους. Σημαντικό βήμα ήταν και η λειτουργία της Professional Skills NBA Academy, με την οποία τοποθετείται ακόμα ένα λιθαράκι στην προσπάθεια υλοποίησης του οράματος της Εθνικής Αρχής Στοιχημάτων για να καταστεί η Κύπρος ένα δίκαιο και ασφαλές κέντρο ανάπτυξης και καινοτομίας στον τομέα των τυχερών παιχνιδιών. Αναντίλεκτα, η αύξηση του εξειδικευμένου προσωπικού θα διευκολύνει την προσπάθεια να προσκλήσει η χώρα μας επενδύσεις υψηλής προστιθέμενης αξίας στον τομέα των τυχερών παιχνιδιών. Η προσέλκυση επενδύσεων παραμένει κομβικής σημασίας. Άλλωστε, για την οικοδόμηση συνθηκών μακροχρόνιας οικονομικής ευημερίας. Η κυβέρνηση ζυγίζει και αξιολογεί τους προβληματισμούς που εγείρονται σε σχέση με την καθολική απαγόρευση στο τομέα του στοιχήματος και των τυχερών παιχνιδιών. Είμαστε έτοιμοι να ακούσουμε τις απόψεις όλων των εμπλεκομένων στον τομέα και να συζητήσουμε τα επόμενα βήματά μας με γνώμονα την αποτελεσματική ρύθμιση της αγοράς και τη λειτουργία της στο πλαίσιο της νομιμότητας, την πάταξη των παράνομων δραστηριοτήτων και την προστασία των παιχτών, των ευάλωτων ομάδων και του κοινού ευρύτερα. Από την πλευρά της, η κυβέρνηση θα συνεχίσει να στηρίζει εμπράκτως τις προσπάθειες της Εθνικής Αρχής Στοιχημάτων για βιώσιμη ανάπτυξη και αποτελεσματική ρύθμιση του τομέα των τυχερών παιχνιδιών. Εύχομαι κάθε επιτυχία στις εργασίες του συνεδρίου και σε όλες τις δραστηριότητες που περιλαμβάνει η Εβδομάδα Ασφαλούς Παιχνιδιού. Κλείνοντας, θα ήθελα και εγώ με τη σειρά μου να εκφράσω τις ευχαριστίες μου στην απερχόμενη Πρόεδρο και Συμβούλιο της Εθνικής Αρχής Στοιχημάτων για την αφοσίωση και το εξαίρετο έργο που έχουν επιτελέσει. Σας ευχαριστώ για την προσοχή σας.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate your support. A keynote speech is a very prominent part in every agenda of every conference. So the keynote speaker must also be a prominent and a very special person. And I can promise you, today we have one of these with us, and in a minute she'll be joining us to deliver her keynote speech. Hard to say what is more interesting, the speech or the speaker. The speech has an interesting topic. It's about reshaping the game, strategies for behavioral change in problem gambling. But Dr. Lisa Bélanger, our keynote speaker, she is, as I said, very special because she combines so many talents and she is so colorful in what she's doing, what she's delivering, and what she's presenting. She's an award-winning researcher, an innovator. She is CEO of Conscious Works, which is a consulting firm teaching habits, skills, and work designed to help leaders and teams to be proactive with mental health and performance. She holds a PhD in behavioral medicine, an executive MBA, and she is a certified exercise psychologist and a high-performance specialist. Prior to the pandemic, she was traveling the world with her 2-month-old baby child, visiting organizations to explore company culture, leadership, and the ability to distress from work, something which we need to know how it really works, so pay her attention. She's also founder of Nights Coming, a national charity that offers wellness programming to cancer survivors, and she is the author of 2 books, Inspire Me Well, Taking Control of Your Health, and A Cup of Mindfulness for the busy and restless. So for us, obviously. Being asked what her greatest accomplishments are, her answer was climbing Mount Kilimanjaro with her father, running the Paris Marathon, and snack holding for 2 tiny humans. So I think we can expect an exciting, an informative, and entertaining keynote speech. Please welcome Dr. Lisa Bélanger.
Good morning.
Thank you again, Dr. Bélanger. That was most exciting, very informative, and of course, very entertaining. We're now going to some regulatory topics and look into the practice of regulators. So for the next 40 minutes, we will have a panel discussion, and we're sharing the regulators' view. I kindly ask my panelists to join me at the panel, please. And by the way, there was no question with Slido so far. Make sure if you do have questions, use your phone and send them to us. Yeah, that's an exciting panel. I'm happy to introduce your panelists to you. So I'll start to my very left, my side, with the local representative of regulation, Spiros Tsakonitis. He works for over 8 years with the National Betting Authority. He heads the launch of the online betting licensing and the overall overhaul of the current legal framework. He will be sharing latest developments with us very soon. In the middle, I'm happy to welcome Mrs. Iliana Minotti. She is the head of the Regulatory and Social Responsibility Units of the Hellenic Gambling Commission. Means she's responsible for drafting regulations and directives. If this relates to games of chance, regulation of games of chance. And she's also very actively engaged in international regulatory organizations such as GREF, which is the European Gaming Regulators Forum, or IAGRA, the International Association of Gaming Regulators. which, by the way, is holding its annual conference in October 21st to 24th, together with IMGL in Rome, which is another beautiful event to be taken into consideration. Last, but of course not least, happy to welcome Luke Camilleri from Malta. He works for 9 years, last 9 years with the MGA, and is managing 2 departments at the authority. One is dealing with player protection, and the second one was investigation. It's the investigation department. On top of that, he's also serving as the money laundering reporting officer of the MGL. So that's for the introduction. We're now diving deep into the world of regulation, and of course, we should start with the local, with the Cyprus regulation. And there was, I think, you launched a new law. Yeah. It's on public review. And I'm happy to learn what you have developed. If you could share some insights, what you've done in Cyprus, what comes next, I think that would be most interesting.
Yeah, of course. First of all, I'd like to welcome you, Joerg, and my fellow panelists to Cyprus. I hope you enjoy your stay, have a great conference. Actually, the new law was submitted to the Ministry of Finance 2 weeks ago. It's the final draft. It's really exciting news for us. The law has been a long time in the making, and it's a departure from the current framework, as it provides for only 2 licenses, a B2B and a B2C. And it essentially introduces a variety of new products, basically all the products that are not currently under a state-granted monopoly. Our main aim with this new framework, if I could crystallize it in a single sentence, is to provide a safe, sustainable, and commercially fair environment to anyone that wishes to partake into gambling. Of course, it's really difficult to create new legislation, which is not the continuation of the previous betting law. And we had to study and assess our regulatory data from the past years, assess our data from our surveys, and international bibliography, and of course, best practices from other jurisdictions. Our main goals when drafting this new legislation was to strike a balance between 3 main pillars. Robust regulation that safeguards society, but in particular, vulnerable groups and consumers, and in a way that will overall establish that only good actors are within the regulated sphere. The second pillar is to ensure that these good actors are awarded. And what do I mean by awarded? I mean these good actors are profitable. So after considering tax, regulation cost, and regulations that have to do with how the product is being delivered to the consumer, that product has to be at least as attractive and as fun as the offerings in the illegal market. And last but not least, we tried not to be over-prescribing and leave room for innovation, both for the industry and for the regulator. In terms of safer gambling, this law dictates the appointment of an SGO and SGD. An SGO is the Safer Gambling Officer, which is a top management level executive, and an SGD is a Safer Gambling Director, which is essentially a member of the board of directors of the operator. Thus, active commitment of both leadership and top management. The law also mandates the establishment of safer gambling policy, action plans, objectives, and KPIs, collaboration with relative stakeholders, annual evaluation and improvement, and of course, reporting to the wider public the results of those objectives. It's something more akin to an EU AML directive and also ISO-like in terms that it creates a circular evergreen management system. In other words, we wanted to place safer gambling at the forefront, or better yet, in the epicenter of what it means to be a licensed gambling operator. The other provision that we are proud to announce has to do with underage gambling. So when assessing our data and current framework, we realized that responsibility is mainly held by the operators and to a smaller degree by the regulator and state. We quickly realized that the major proponent of this equation was missing. We know from our surveys that half the population was introduced to gambling by a family member. We also know from our operators that most of these underage participants use their parents' or grandparents' ID or credit cards in order to gamble. So our suggestion, which is kind of radical, is to find the parents or legal guardians every time their children are found to be gambling, either online or in the betting shops, regardless of whether they were aware of the children's participation or not. The fine, of course, will be a progressive one that multiplies as every repeated offense. And in this way, we believe that we introduce parental responsibility in the aforementioned equation and force parents to become more involved.
Thank you very much. I think that's really remarkable. First of all, it looks like a checklist where you tick all the boxes of modern regulation. One thing was really interesting to listen to me. It's the same thing that Ms. Christoforou raised in her welcome speech. You are taking the responsibility of parents very serious.
Yes.
You sanction parents if minors, underage players, play. That's something which I don't think is common in every jurisdiction. I'll be keen to learn about the progress in your experiences.
We have a similar provision when it comes to underage driving. Mm-hmm. So we believe that it's equally important to inject parental responsibility into gambling and safer gambling in general.
Right. Thank you very much. So this is new law. So, Iliana, from the legal perspective, what are the challenges a regulator is facing or politicians are facing when they are going to develop new law, new regulation for the sake of protecting players? I think it's always a challenge, but what would you think is most important to take into consideration?
First of all, let me thank the National Betting Authority for inviting me here. It's my pleasure to be in this panel. The challenges. I could sum up the challenges with three words. Three words and one principle, let's say. Balance, adaptation, and harmonization are the three words, because we, regulators and policymakers, have to find a sensitive balance of that is between economic interests and government revenues, the sustainability of the industry, in other words, with public health concerns and the protection of players and the society in general. Then we have to keep up with fast-paced technological innovations, especially now with online gambling. And harmonization has to do with the difficulty of regulating across jurisdictions with many different laws, with different cultures and political contexts, but in an industry that is operating globally due to the internet. Now, the key principle I was thinking about is if we realize, as we heard before, that the decision to gamble represent a choice, then the responsible gambling rests upon an informed choice, and that should be our work as a regulator. Now, I think what we heard before about the behavior and how this choice, this decision is made, could help us even more if we see it in that perspective.
Thank you very much. I think what stands out is your focus on the player, on the demand of players, also looking at the industry. Regulation of gambling is not only interdiction and restrictive regulation. And so far, do I understand you right, that you think that the player makes that decision where he plays? And if black market offerings are available, he may have an option to play outside the licensed market where player protection takes not place in any way. Would you think, or can I ask you, what would you think is the most important aspect when you talk about balance, meaning there is the player, there's the industry, and there's the regulator who applies the law. What would you think is most important to be balanced?
The protection to be done in a way that we are not talking about banning things, because it's clear that when you ban things, there are many more dangers that appear. For example, we have seen how much illegal networks are growing, so we cannot ban gambling or we cannot ban advertisements, but we have to find a balance of how we can protect players in the society and what we can do to raise awareness and educate people to make informed decisions and protect themselves instead of banning things and making things that will lead them to illegal networks where no one can actually have the control or do anything to protect.
Right. I fully concur with you. I'm from Germany, and we have some issues with the channelization rate against the black market operators. And this is a matter of balance. If the industry is not competitive, the player is leaving the market. So we have to evaluate our current regulation, and I think this is what you keep in mind when you are drafting your own one. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Look, Malta stands for long-term experience in regulating online gaming. And you're always reinventing the wheel and doing something new and improving regulation. So, as far as I know, the MGA, the Maltese Gaming Authority, developed and introduced a 5-year safer gambling strategy starting in 2021. If you could share some insights on the different projects you've done so far. You've undertaken, for example, audits, processes, and what are Malta's plan for the future?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Joerg. So basically, we are currently reaching the end of the 5 years safer gambling strategy. It started in 2021, and basically it revolved around two very important pillars. So on the one hand, we have the shared responsibility concept. So we believe that ensuring a safe gambling environment is not only the responsibility of operators, but it is also our responsibility as regulators. It is also the responsibility of help organizations, game providers, players themselves at the end of the day. So that was the first pillar, collaboration and shared responsibility. The second pillar was that we wanted to ensure that we have comprehensive audits in place to assess our licensees and to make sure that our licensees are adhering to their RG obligations. And the way how we did this, basically, we started in 2021 with the creation of the player protection team, the player protection department. You see, before 2021, at the MGA, we didn't have a dedicated responsible gaming team. In fact, we used to conduct responsible gaming audit and checks through our external auditors, through our prudential compliance team. But we wanted to move away from that setup. We wanted to conduct our own audits, not having to rely on third parties. And that way, it allowed us, first and foremost, to delve deeper into the audits themselves and to gain knowledge, to gain understanding, experience, which ultimately led us to be able to guide the industry. So that was the first phase. The second phase was to update the Player Protection Directive. So the PPD, the regulations, were initially published in 2018. And as you all know, the gambling industry is very complex. It's always evolving. So we wanted to make sure that they are still relevant, the regulations. And we did this. The first phase was we conducted our own research on papers and studies out there to get a better understanding. We also held meetings with various stakeholders, with researchers, help organizations. We also engaged experts in the field to go through our existing regulations at the time and for them to propose changes to them. But I think the the most important aspect was the familiarization visits. Basically, these familiarization visits are informal meetings with our operators, B2C operators. We sat down with them. It was a platform. We held a very open and honest discussion with them. And the idea was for us to understand what was happening on the ground, what is working, what is not, what challenges they were facing. And that led us, to ultimately publish the updated player protection directive in 2013. There were quite a few changes, but I think the biggest change was the introduction of 5 markers of harm that we wanted licensees to implement into their detection systems. These are increase and frequency of deposits, multiple payment methods, cancelled withdrawals, change of responsible gaming tools, and communication-based indicators. I mean, these are just 5. There are many other markers of harm, and we encourage licensees, obviously, to implement more markers of harm. But at a minimum, we are now expecting licensees to have in place these markers of harm, these 5. So yes, in parallel to this, and taking me back to what I said in the beginning of we wanted to ensure that we have proper audits in place, we developed three audit types to conduct on our licensees. So the first audit was the responsible gaming website checks. So we are looking into the responsible gaming tools offered on the websites and making sure that, first and foremost, they are in line with the regulations, and also that they are indeed functioning, the self-exclusions, the limits, reality checks. So that was the first audit. The second audit was desktop review of the policies and procedures of the licensees. And the third one, the one that takes most time, is the full scope responsible gaming audit, where it's a mix of responsible gaming website checks, desktop reviews of policies and procedures, and also we take a sample of players showing signs of problem gambling to test out how effective the licensee systems are. So that's a very high-level overview of what we've done so far. What we are going to do in the upcoming year, obviously we're going to continue improve on our systems to become more effective and efficient. I think whoever works with the regulator, they understand the challenges with resources, so we want to make sure that we do more with the resources we have. And how we intend to do this basically is to shift away from full scope responsible gaming audits and identify high-risk area, high-risk trends, and focus our audits on these areas. So we conduct thematic reviews instead of full scope audits. And that allows us to conduct more audits on a larger population, And lastly, we are also working on publishing further guidance as well to the industry. This will complement the Player Protection Directive, and they will further explain what our expectations are for licensees.
Right, it's quite a lot. At the beginning of a 5-year period, you certainly cannot predict the outcome of what will be the results in the end after 5 years, which is next year, of course. But for the time being, if you summarize in a nutshell maybe, what would you think are the key findings of the audits so far?
Yes, so we conducted quite a number of audits. I think one of the most common shortcomings that we came across is the fact that customer-facing teams are sometimes working in silos. What do I mean? So in a B2C operation, you have different customer-facing teams. You have the AML team, the responsible gaming team, VIP teams, and each team is collecting information, valuable information from players, and they are not sharing it with the other teams. For example, we've seen cases where the AML teams are conducting source of wealth checks, requesting information, seller information from a player, but this is not being shared. This was not being shared with the responsible gaming team, and ultimately there was lack of information for the RG team to make sufficient interventions. I mean, I'm not a fan of conducting affordability checks on all players, but I think when you have high-risk situations, at some point you need to conduct an affordability check to understand what the player is capable of losing. So yes, that was one of the most common findings. another common pitfall that we came across is the fact that policies and procedures, not just responsible gaming policies and procedures, but procedures in general, they are not always properly documented. And in some cases, this led to staff, to employee staff, not adhering to the company's own policies and procedures. I mean, at the end of the day, having properly documented policies and procedures is not just for the company to present to the regulator when they are conducting audits, but it's a guide, you know, for employees to follow when they are in doubt of something, of what the next steps are. So I mean, it's not all negative. So there were very positive notes as well that we've seen. For example, the use of AI technology. We've seen that operators are now investing more in AI technology and machine learning technology, especially within their detection systems. So obviously we encourage the use of AI, especially in detection systems. I understand that it is a challenge for startups and for smaller companies, but yes, I think it's the way to go in the future, you know.
How far is the industry involved or responding so far?
On our strategy or NI in general?
I think the industry, the gaming operators, how far are they involved in this progress? Is there any dialogue? Are they responding?
Yes, so for dialogue, it's an ongoing thing. So apart from the audits, we are still conducting familiarization. We're still meeting with operators, not only through audits, but also with other meetings, face-to-face meetings. So yes, we have a very, very good relationship with our operators. We firmly believe that, again, it's a shared responsibility. You know, it's not a matter of us telling them what we expect, but it goes both ways. You know, so they have a lot of data which we can use as well for our own guidance as well. So
that makes sense. So next year we will be looking forward to receiving your final report and the evaluation of that interesting project. I think we see similar elements in every regulation and every jurisdiction, but there's a lot of things that are customized and that are different. Gambling regulation is not harmonized across the European Union so far. Spiros, would you think, are there any areas which could be or even should be harmonized if it comes to player protection?
Yeah. We believe that EU harmonization in gambling is something that has to be approached carefully and most of all with honesty. Because right now we don't have the means or the tools to facilitate meaningful and fast cooperation between regulators, let alone have a mechanism that enables regulators to react directly to fast-pacing technological improvements or even reach a consensus on polarizing matters such as player safety between culturally different countries with different approaches and different experiences. However, we believe there are some areas, as you mentioned, that could be offered for harmonization. In particular, areas such as self-exclusion and advertising. For example, there is no reason why we can't implement common horizontal standards and, if not, create a pan-European self-exclusion platform, create the interconnectivity between our national platforms in order for one EU citizen to be able to exclude from gambling in the entire Union. As far as advertising is concerned, the recent proliferation of gambling ads in sports, such as the adoption for the first time of an official gambling sponsor in major tournaments, such as the Euro and the Copa America in the summer, and now Champions League, Europa League, Conference League, and even our own national league, have now, I mean, this is a big development and should raise the alarm to European regulators. One cannot witness the current developments and not draw a parallel to what happened to Formula One. I don't know how many of you remember what happened in Formula One and the proliferation of cigarette ads. And just to add to this, I mean, football is far more popular than Formula One, and its frequency is not even the same ballpark. And in my opinion, we are a few years away from a public outcry And when governments overreact, they do overreact, and it's usually too late for a reasonable discussion. I'm not suggesting like a pan-European code of advertising, but a common approach in regards to sports sponsorship is needed and fast, maybe in a way of a guideline or some red lines, or if we agree to phase it out, or how to do it, or how to limit it, or how to change how it appears. I mean, that's an area that we should cooperate in order to protect the industry, because we all know the benefits of having illegal gambling advertisement and the disadvantages of not having them.
Your new regulation, what's the position on advertising for gambling? Is there anything that needs to be taken into consideration further, or is this a more or less reluctant approach to gambling advertising? You show some critical attitude because, in my view, I understand that you think it's just too much, the awareness of gaming ads. What is your stake?
As I said previously, we try to not over-prescribe in our main law, so it's up to the regulator to enact its own code of advertisement and a practical guide to it, in the same way that we already do. Currently, we pre-approve all advertisements and sponsorships, and that allowed us to control the public's perception of what it means to partake into sports betting. And if you consider the transformation that both our local operators and us had on this matter, it was huge, and it wouldn't be possible if we didn't have the tools and we didn't have the opportunity to pre-approve and protect the market early on.
One of the main arguments of the industry pro-advertising is, of course, delivering information. The most important information is who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who is licensed and who is black market operating. I think there's a discussion across so many jurisdictions in Europe, from a total ban until it should be more liberalized. Probably it's interesting to hear your take on this as well. Jona, what's the Greek position?
We also have the pre-approval of the commercial plans of the operators, and apart from that, we have issued a directive that all commercial all kinds of promotion, all kinds of advertisements have to be marked with disclaimers and the AGC logo, so that the consumers know which advertisement is legal and which operator is legal. So this is one more step to distinguish between the legal ones and the illegal ones. Apart from that, we have many common regulatory tools like self-exclusion, limits, self-assessments, audits. Of course, 30% of our audits since the beginning of 2023 are related to protection, to provisions that have to do with player protection, reporting platforms where the consumers can, anyone actually can report either violations of legal operators, something that has to do with violations of the rules and regulations, or anonymously through our platform, that is Whistlers. They can report illegal operators, and that has led us to expand our blacklist that now has about 7,000 entries of illegal sites of illegal operators. That's helping us to actually serve the two strategic pillars of AGC that have to do with consumer protection, players protection, and trying to minimize the illegal networks.
Right. I heard coming back to advertising, when an operator is going to broadcast commercial TV ads, there is a system of pre-approval within your authority, right? That sounds like a lot of work to me. Very time-consuming.
Yes,
How does it work in practice?
there is a unit specifically dedicated to studying the commercial plans that are coming. And there are some, in some cases, we ask for modifications according to the regulatory framework, or sometimes we even reject some commercial plans because they do not follow the rules, the regulations and the directives that have been issued for this specific purpose.
Sure, I think operators must learn the requirements and then apply them, of course. Can you give us a feeling, maybe a percentage of the portion of complaints if someone is going to submit a draft commercial ad? Is the industry complying very much and learning by doing, or is there still an enormous high portion of, drafts which are not meeting the requirements?
No, actually, our operators have been trained, let's say, educated to follow the rules, so we are not talking about non-compliance. Maybe sometimes some things are seen from a different perspective because they are they have to think of their profitability and making their product attractive. And that's where the balance is sensitive sometimes.
Yeah,
but
back to the rules.
We don't have non-compliance.
All about the...
At least at a high percentage that should be mentioned.
Right. How is Malta treating advertising for gaming?
Yes, with regards to advertisements, I think we have a pretty much similar position to Cyprus and Greece. I mean, I think it is a very delicate discussion, and regulation is essential, I think. I think it's very difficult to find the balance between regulation and allowing the industry, the freedom to promote their services. But I don't think our position is that a total ban is not the solution, because, as we've said in the beginning, it could have negative repercussions of players resorting to black markets at the end of the day. So I think it's about limiting the where and where these adverts are placed, and also limiting the content, regulating the content. For example, in Malta, we have a specific set of regulations on commercial communications, and they stipulate what an advert can and cannot include. For example, an advert, a promotion, cannot be targeted towards kids, minors. For example, they cannot make use of characters that are associated with children. For example, Disney characters. An advert cannot provide misleading information on the chances of winnings. I mean, there's plenty of others. For example, an advert cannot suggest that gambling is a solution to financial or personal problems. So I think it's all about, apart from regulating the where and when, it's also about regulating the content of the advert itself.
Thank you. I think we cannot continue our discussion today without touching on new technologies. Artificial intelligence, of course, it's one of these keywords which is aware almost everywhere. How do you think these new technology can be implemented to improve player protection? Probably, Joanna, you can share your view with us. What's the Jeleni Commission doing?
Yes. About a year ago, we decided to cooperate with a Danish company, Mindway AI, with the aim to run a pilot project in assessing risk factors in gambling behavior. We are using players' data, neuroscientific insights, and assessments of the experts to analyze a set of data in order to be able to take measures, proceed to interventions in order to make the environment safer. Now that I have heard Dr. Lisa Bélanger's talk, I think that this kind of science should also be included in maybe one of our cooperations for analyzing the data, because I think this will lead us to forming a more comprehensive regulatory framework and realize how players are making their decisions and really behave, let's say, when they are gambling. We are not in a position to share more information about this pilot project because it's still running. I hope either next year or maybe at some point later this year at some other forum, we will be able to share all the analysis that we will have conducted and realize how we as regulators can actually use the benefits of AI to better form our regulations.
So first you are collecting and analyzing data, which I think is mainly focusing on player behavior. Mm-hmm. And you're also not looking at what players are doing, you're also asking why they are making certain decisions. This psychological background, which builds a bridge to Mrs. Bélanger's.
That's why we need the collaboration with other scientists as well and other companies like the AI company, because we are trying to find out what we should do both at a regulatory and at a supervisory level to make the whole ecosystem safer.
Right. And it's still the beginning of regulation. The EU AI Act, I think it's passed by the European Council in June this year, needs to be transferred into national law within 2 years' time across the European Union member states. So regulation is, if it comes to new technology, almost a little bit behind, but here I think it's more or less advanced. It's a challenge for everyone to develop this, because AI is developing and progressing very fast. That's something which has been a topic on your agenda as well?
Yeah, first I wanted to ask, so you analyze player data on behalf of the regulators in order to reach conclusions and...
A specific set of data that is adequate for analysis.
From a particular operator, for example? And...
No, not from a particular one. For, I think, half of them. I'm not sure about details because these are being analyzed by our IT department, but there is a set of data that is a sample that can be representative in terms of number and in terms of time period to make the analysis more accurate.
Do you also test do you evaluate the interventions as well, or?
Sorry?
Do you evaluate interventions and?
After analyzing, after taking the insights of the neuroscientists and the other assessments, then we will try to find out what interventions would help us improve the framework.
So we went about it in the completely opposite way. Mm-hmm. We mandated through our player protection regulations that all operators have to establish objective criteria and classify their players according to their risk. And so our requirement is that they can prove to us how they are effective, and because we, as a regulator, we don't want to pretend that we know everything. We want to give the chance to the industry to provide solutions, and from that experience, then we might reach like Luke said, markers of harm, objective markers of harm that we mandate to the operator, and then the operator uses those set of markers. But currently, we are letting the operators to innovate and show us whether they can come up with an idea that is valuable for the industry.
Thank you very much. That's a good point taken. Apart from all the natural intelligence we see in Malta, is the artificial intelligence an important aspect in your authority too?
Yes, definitely, and it's something that we expect from our operators, especially before we used to see a lot of detection systems based on thresholds. For example, an operator would identify a player to be suffering from gambling harm if the player lost a certain amount of money. Now we are seeing a shift in mindset where the detection systems are mostly based on change in behavior rather than actual thresholds of losses of deposit pairs. And I think this in itself is a very good marker of harm. When a player displays changes in behavior, that is telling you to look into more detail. And yes, we are seeing a shift in mindset from operators. They are investing into these AI technologies. So obviously, it is a challenging for startups and for small companies to reach the same level. But yes, I mean, the technology is there nowadays. It facilitates everyone's job, so let's make use of it.
Right. I mean, the industry is implementing AI and it's done it before. Bots for customer service, it's not a new thing. It's well known for years. But to improve player protection and enhance the product, the player's experience, on all these things, I think we're on a way that things are moving very fast forward. I have a question for you, Sparrows, from the audience. The question is, smaller operators lose profits promoting responsible gambling. Larger ones do only the minimum required. How will the regulator address this imbalance?
So yeah, from what we have gathered, there are three types of operators when it comes to safer gambling. There are those that simply comply, there are those that compete in order to better themselves, and there are those that are leaders in the area. We tried through our regulations to create a scalable solution for everyone, because we know we have our domestic operators, which are smaller in size, they're not multinational companies. So we had to consider them as well. But we believe that with the new law, new products are going to be injected into the market. The operators will themselves become more sustainable and more willing to enhance their safer gambling measures. Moreover, we have drafted a safer gambling standard, which we have presented to the other European regulators, and we are currently trying to make it an ISO standard. So we're going through the procedure, and it's a 3-tier system. And basically, what we want to create, and what I mentioned previously with the mandated appointment of an SGD and SGO, is to create a system that a circular system that reevaluates itself and improves. So it's better to have a system and then build upon it.
Thank you. Excellent. So I hope this answers this question. If there are further questions, please send them to me. For the time being, I think we are done. There's no more questions. That leads me to a big thank you to my panelists. Please join me in thanking them for their contributions. It's excellent. We're going to have a 20 minutes break from now, meaning that, well, let's say, I would say 12 o'clock. It would be nice to have you all here seated again for the next panels and sessions and presentations. Time for a coffee. Please enjoy.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων.
Hello? Can you hear me? Loud and clear. All right, I can hear you too also. It's a little difficult to do that right now. You're gonna have a... Okay. Sound-wise, you're good to go.
Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε
Hello.
Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων.
The girls are talking to you through the chat. Good.
Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων. Σε κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. The 7th Safer Gambling Conference, organized by the National Betting Authority, is about to begin. Before the official start of the conference, we would like to briefly draw your attention to a few operational matters in order to ensure the smooth running of the event. First, please make sure that your mobile phone is switched to silent mode. You will find a QR code in front of you, which you can scan to access the agenda of the conference. For free internet access, simply connect to the open wireless network under the name Hilton Honors Meeting. For any further information or assistance that you may require during the conference, please don't hesitate to contact the IMH Secretariat outside.
Κάθε παιχνίδι υπάρχει ένας αληθινός σούπερ ήρωας για να προσέχει πως το περιβάλλον που παίζεις είναι πάντα ασφαλές. Να σου θυμίζει να μην παίζεις όταν είσαι αναστατωμένος. Να σου προτείνει τον αυτοαποκλεισμό όταν ξεφεύγεις από τα όρια σου. Δήλωσε συμμετοχή στο www.sgw.cy και έλα στην εβδομάδα ασφαλούς παιχνιδιού 7 έως 13 Οκτωβρίου για να ενημερωθείς για τον ασφαλή στοιχηματισμό και τα τυχερά παιχνίδια. Ενημερωνόμαστε, συζητάμε, θέτουμε όρια. Ασφάλεια. Ο αληθινός ήρωας σε κάθε παιχνίδι. Διοργανωτής Εθνική Αρχή Στοιχημάτων.
Yes, thanks for returning on time, so we can continue with our next presentation. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Naomi Muggleton, who is assistant professor at Warwick Business School, also an associate member of the University of Oxford's Department of Social Policy and Intervention, and which is most important for the topic of her presentation. She's leading a multi-year project with the UK Gambling Commission that leverages banking transaction data to inform regulatory policy. Welcome on the stage, Mrs. Naomi Muggleton. Thank you. Thank you. And please don't forget, if you have questions after the presentation, they can be answered, but only if you send them via Slido. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you so much for the warm welcome and being able to speak here today. My name is Naomi Muggleton. I'm an assistant professor of behavioural science at the University of Warwick, and I'm also an associate member at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford. And my background is in psychology, but in the last few years I've done lots of work looking at how we can use big data to identify individuals that might be suffering from harm, and thinking about ways in which we can design policy in an effective way based on evidence from big data. So, as I said, I'm a psychologist, and I want to talk about the reasons in which we might want to think about how we do psychology in a new way. So, I'm going to take you back to the beginning of psychology with this guy Freud. So, his approach was typically to have one-on-one conversations with individuals that might be suffering from some sort of disorder. And the idea behind this, the impetus, was that if you talked to an individual at a very intimate level, you could get some insight and try and treat the individual. Psychologists don't like to go back to that past. They now like to think of themselves as being very scientific. And of course, a scientist needs to have a lab coat. They need to have participants in their experimental room. And they like to strap lots of electrodes onto people so that it seems extremely rigorous. But of course, there is a common analogy between these two. And they're both coming from a perspective that we need to understand behaviors in terms of addiction. So from this perspective, harm is experienced as cravings, as urges associated with a specific behavior. And I'm lifting this directly from the Psychiatry Bible, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And the idea is that behaviors that are often harmless for the majority of people will be harmful for some small proportion of individuals who take it into a maladaptive direction. So we can think about sex addiction, shopping addiction, compulsive eating or dieting. These behaviors in and of themselves aren't necessarily harmful, but some individuals have a maladaptive relationship. And when we think about the problem gambling, responsible gambling dichotomy, this really fits into this narrative where there is a line in the ground over which something becomes problematic and everything else is acceptable and routine. Now, part of the reason why we've thought about it this way is because those traditional ways of studying psychology, either that one-on-one therapy or thinking about having individuals come into the lab, are financially expensive. You need to invest in recruitment, maybe you're paying participants, and it's temporarily expensive, so it takes time. And what do you do when you have finite resources? You triage and you look at the individuals who are suffering the most. So we've typically looked at individuals who gamble the most or those who suffer the most, either through experience of affected others or who are affected themselves directly. And the idea behind this is that if we can just understand why problem gamblers behave the way they do, we can prevent them from experiencing harm, and we can prevent other people from experiencing harm in the future. This is the traditional approach that psychology has taken. Now, I'm going to argue that there's a problem with this dichotomy, and I'm going to give some evidence from research that I've published to back this up. So, we've looked at small proportions of individuals who are at that most extreme end of gambling. And like I said, that makes sense. You've got finite resources you need to triage in some way. But what this means is that we know very little, surprisingly little, about how gambling affects the majority of people. What are the harms? What are the benefits? And what behaviors are unaffected by gambling? We really don't have a very good idea of this from traditional methods. And we're also selecting individuals when we're doing these treatments, either in the experiment or one-to-one. We've got people who are self-selecting in, people who recognize there's a problem and have sought help, or maybe a loved one has recognized that there's a problem. I think this is problematic because I don't think you should be making public policy that affects everybody based on a biased sample. Ideally, we would have a look and see how the population was affected. So not looking at a one-on-one relationship like Freud, not looking at dozens or hundreds of people in the lab, but looking at millions of people. So what we have is a really good sense of the psychology of problem gambling. There's always more we need to know, but we've learned a lot in recent decades. But what we need is a view of what harms, if any, and what benefits, if any, affect the population at large. And this is where we have a really exciting opportunity to go to the third wave of psychological research. So moving from that Freudian approach to the experimental approach to thinking about how we can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand how people behave across a whole country. I'm now going to talk about the power of digital footprint. So my research isn't just looking at gambling. It's a very important part of my research portfolio. But more broadly, I'm interested in what we can learn about people from how they engage with technology. You may have seen this quote from The Economist magazine. The world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. And like oil in its crude form, it's pretty useless. But when we refine it, it can be incredibly powerful. So you don't need me to tell you that the last decade has seen a huge boom in digital participation and user-generated data. And we're all constantly making new data when we spend money with our credit cards, when we're on our phones, we're engaging with social media, and so on. And this has given us the opportunity to understand how people behave, not in the hundreds or the dozens, but across millions of people. And in the largest sample I'm going to look at today, we've got 6.5 million people in the UK. So, digital footprints can help us to tackle some of the really exciting problems in society, and gambling is no exception. What do I mean by digital footprints? I mean the traces we leave behind when we engage with social media activity, mobile phone metadata, so when we're on Google Apps and Google Maps, we're leaving a trace of where we've been, bank data, which I use a lot, and network analysis, but there are many others you can think of. And the benefit of using this type of analysis is that you're looking at data that is generalizable outside the lab. We're not setting up these contrived experiments, we're seeing what people actually do in an unobtrusive, anonymous way. And it also means that we're not relying on people's memory of what they did last month, how much they spent, how they felt. We can look and see what people do in real time. So I'm now going to talk about a paper that I wrote that was published a couple of years ago in Nature Human Behavior, applying this principle. And this came about through serendipity. This was my first piece of research in the gambling space. I was working with the largest retail bank in the UK, Lloyds Banking Group. They've got about 30 million customers. And we were doing lots of different projects, but their customer vulnerability team came to me and said, we want to be able to detect individuals who are suffering harm. What can you do with our data? And the more I thought about it, financial data is incredibly rich. You can't just tell things like how much people are paid, how much money they owe, but you can see where they go, how routinely they go to the supermarket. Are they someone that's organized or someone that looks a bit chaotic? All of these things you can tell about an individual from their bank data. So in our largest sample, we looked at an anonymous group of 6.5 million people in the UK. That's more than 10% of the UK population. And this was over 7 years. Which bank you bank with, at least in the UK, is a pretty random thing. So we don't have a self-selection. We have a true cross-section of society. And we can look at really specific individual level behaviors. So we're not just looking at aggregates of how much people spend. We can follow individuals through time across 7 years to see how much they gamble and what goes on in their lives at the same time and afterwards. Crucially, only a bank can see this view. The regulator can't see this view. The operators can't see things that are beyond the scope of what's happening in-app or in play. This is something that is a really privileged position for a bank to be able to see. I don't intend to go through all of these, but what I want to show here is the stark results that we found. So each of these dots represents not one person, but a few thousand people. And we've got people who gamble at different levels. From this red dot here are people who don't gamble. And then we've got the first 1% of gamblers, second 1% of gamblers, all the way down to the top 1% of gamblers. And that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we've got 15 different financial outcomes. These aren't cherry-picked for the most sensational ones. We looked at 15, and these are all 15. And what we find is that for all of these, gambling is associated with more harm. Now, the problem gambling narrative would say that we would just see a problem at that last dot. So everybody would be fine, it would be continuous, and then you'd see an uptick or a downtick, depending on the outcome. We found that even low levels of gambling were associated with much larger harm. We also looked at harm with non-financial outcomes as well. Again, these aren't cherry-picked, but what we found is that all measures that we looked at, with the exception of one, were associated with more harm. And we found this for some quite surprising things. So the financial ones, maybe that makes sense, just spending more on an activity. But we find that people spend less on their education. They spend less on self-care, they spend less on prescriptions, and they spend more nights awake browsing their phone, which is an indication they're worried about money because they're on their banking app between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. So for all of these outcomes, we see that even quite low levels can be associated with an increased risk. We then looked to see about long-term outcomes. So we looked at how much people gambled in 2013 for 6.5 million people, and then we looked at what happened in their lives in the next 7 years. We calculated the proportion of their income that they spent to control for people being wealthier, and we used machine learning algorithms to detect whether or not they had received unemployment benefits between 2014 and 2019. And we predicted the likelihood that they would go from being employed to being unemployed in the future. We found that gambling 10% of your monthly spend increases the probability of unemployment by 12%. But this effect was linear. So 1% was associated with an increase of 1.2%. Gambling 20% was associated with a 25% increase. So even a small proportion of your monthly spend gambled was associated with an increase. We also did this for disability. We can tell from the way in which payments occur in the UK whether or not people are receiving disability payments. We found that for each percentage point of your monthly income that you gamble, you increase your risk of becoming disabled in the next 5 years by 1.1%. And that's a linear effect. So if I'm gambling 10%, my risk is 11%, and so on. At the most extreme, we looked at mortality. The bank knows when somebody is deceased. And we fitted the type of models that you'd have for survival analysis if you were looking at a cancer drug, for instance. And what we find is that this is also associated with an increased risk of mortality. So just to make those numbers real, if we take an individual, a woman who is 44, and you look at, she's gambling 30% of her income, the probability of death is increased by 37% in the next 5 years. And this is after controlling for the things we think might be important. So what this shows is that the problem gambling dichotomy is problematic in and of itself. There isn't this switching point where gambling goes from being harmless to harmful. It's more of a continuum. And I often think about it as being like fast food. There aren't problem McDonald's consumers and healthy McDonald's consumers, but instead there's a continuum. It's okay to have a treat now and then, but you want to be mindful that each additional meal that you have might have some associated risk. But what we do know is that by any current definition, for instance using PGSI, we are underestimating grossly the amount of harm that exists, certainly in the UK population, and we've no reason to believe that this doesn't generalize to other markets. And if we take the view that 1 in 4 gamblers experience harm, which is a number that was often quoted in the media after this paper came out, we can extrapolate this to 10% of the UK population experiencing harm, which is way higher than the traditional estimates. So, after this paper came out, we've spent a lot of time working with ministers in the UK, members of parliament, to try and implement this, and this has resulted, as was mentioned, in a 3-year project in collaboration with the Gambling Commission, who have been very supportive of this approach to future regulation. And what does the future look like? Well, I think that a public health approach requires us to have population-level data. We can't just rely on surveying problem gamblers and their affected others. We need to know what the effect is across the whole population. And serendipity led to this data set. As I said, although I'm happily immersed in the gambling research space now, this only came about because a bank thought that this would be a good project to help support customers. If you'd asked me this in 18 months ago, I would have said that there was no pipeline for future research like this. But luckily, that call to action was heard by the Gambling Commission in the UK. And for those of you who follow the regulatory market in the UK, this landmark paper came out from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport last year. And it really highlights the importance of using digital data to understand harm. And this is a quote from it saying, unlike alcohol, key input for gambling research is operator data. The Commission will build on the expansion of data sets that it collects. And I'm really happy to be a part of them expanding that at the moment. Warwick Business School, where I work in the Midlands of the UK, is currently partway through a collaboration with the UK regulator to do this. And we're thinking about questions like, how do people fund their gambling? What can we see being displaced in their spending? When their gambling goes up, does spending go down on benign activities like the cinema, or more important activities like paying for clothes for the kids? We're also looking at what patterns of play are particularly associated with harm, building machine learning algorithms, and these are things that operators might be able to implement as well. And we're thinking about whether we can use things like large language models. I'm sure you're all familiar with ChatGPT and the like. Whether we can use those to try and understand and sort of detect the tremors in the water that might indicate that somebody isn't quite showing up yet on PGSI as experiencing harm, but nonetheless, they might be on that journey. So we might be able to detect things a bit earlier. And we're doing that by matching bank data and PGSI scores. So where do we go from here? Well, there's been a real paucity of operator data in this area of research, and it's been really challenging for researchers to be able to see how people are playing and engaging with products. The regulator has power to some extent to be able to request this data, and that's definitely the direction of travel if we read the document that's been produced by the UK government. And it's up to other regulatory authorities to think about the extent to which data is made accessible for research purposes. So lots of really new, exciting opportunities for researchers to really think about how we can use this digital revolution to understand gambling-related harm. And ultimately, there's an ambition to be able to get to a single customer view. So instead of having lots of fragmented data from different operators that don't talk to one another, we've already begun to do some of this work to think about what could potentially be learned by having a single customer view. And thinking of lessons that we can learn from other regulatory areas, like the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. The way that credit scores work, for instance, is to stitch people together. So it's definitely doable, and we're having conversations to think about how we might be able to implement that. But it's really up to the researchers and the regulators to decide how the data can be used in a way that respects the fact that it's incredibly sensitive data, but also allows us to be able to use it for the public good. And I just want to leave you with a quote that I think is particularly nice in this situation. It's from Professor Carl Sagan. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And we need to build that evidence base so that we can understand what harm, if any, exists. Lastly, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project and my funders, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
So let's wait and see if there are any questions. The answer is no, meaning you provided simply clarity. Thank you very much again for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if I'm not mistaken, we will have have another panel discussion at the moment, and I'm kindly ask my panelists to join me here at the stage, please.
Τι κάνετε?
Το χρωματοκόκκινο.
In our last panel, we could share the view of regulators of various jurisdictions, discussing responsible gaming and new developments. Now it's the part of the industry to discuss this matter, to comment on it, and to share some insights. I'm happy to introduce my panelists to you, starting with ladies first, of course. Ms. Katerina Giannakaku Razello. She's legal advisor with more than 21 years of practice in legal and compliance, various companies. And she's responsible gaming and compliance officer at OPAP. Next to Katerina, we welcome Robert Monroe. He serves as head of sports betting, head of sports services compliance with Bet365, provides long-established global experience and works for the world market leader in sports betting. And finally, happy to introduce you to Ioannis Spanoudakis, Chief Compliance Officer of Kaizen Gaming, you know, operating two very well-established branches, which are Stichiman and Betano. Some years ago, you served as the CEO of the Olympic Games in Athens in 2004, 20 years ago, very impressive. And you also served as CEO of the board of directors from OMPAC between 2009 and 2012. And finally, and this is what you still are, you're also a member of the Kaizen management team. So I'm happy to start this discussion first, and probably Katerina, we started our discussion with the regulators in the middle of the exciting contributions looking at modern technologies. And we've learned that modern technologies play a role in regulation and in the near future. Just to start with that from the beginning, in how far do you see this regulation of, or legislation of modern technologies become a challenge or an opportunity for the industry?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be among well-esteemed colleagues and incredible scientists. I'm going to start talking a bit about the example of OPAP. OPAP uses artificial intelligence. We use our safety net algorithm. It's an algorithm that has been developed in-house, and it was developed to monitor playing behavior before customers get to self-exclude. They have the option and the statutory obligation for operators to provide the option of self-exclusion. So we try to monitor and train our predictive models to see their behavior before they reach that point, the point of self-exclusion. And we try to see like their depositing repeatability, the money loss escalation, the long duration sessions in the middle of the night or in unusual time intervals. So we try to monitor a lot of data, a lot of attributes, to realize how their behavior changed before they reached that point. And to do that, we use artificial intelligence. Well, at first, when The model was applied since 2018, so it's for quite a long time that we use that technology. When we started, the first challenge that we had to see is that, is it legal? Is it legal to use artificial intelligence? Because you understand that we are not there where regulation obliges operators to use artificial intelligence. But the first question was are we allowed to use that type of technology? And then there were a lot of constraints from data privacy point of view. So first of all, we have regulation over gaming. We have regulation over personal data. We must ensure that we're not breaching the rules and breaching privacy of our customers, okay, and that we leave them with a freedom of choice. But then again, to use artificial intelligence, you need big data. And to have big data, you can't be based on consent, on customer consent. So you need to establish your legitimate interest to do that. So you see how different regulatory frameworks are combined together, of course, creating challenges for operators. And then we are in view of the AI Act, a very recent European regulation in the summer of 2024. In Greece, we had already a local law regulating artificial intelligence in terms of was disposing for a data registry, artificial intelligence registry, and also a code of ethics for the use of artificial intelligence. And now we see that it is even more heavily regulated in terms of we need to find out on a very short term, because the regulation has 2 milestones in terms of time. The first is in February 2025, where all operators must prohibit AI practices that pose unacceptable risks. And then there's a second, let's say, deadline in 2 years from issuance by the summer of 2026, where we have to see which are our high-risk operations on the use of AI and take measures to protect our customers against those risks. So you see that there are many challenges that come with the use of AI in our gaming platform, online platform, aiming at protecting our players. So I think that the most important is to do a collaboration, a collaborative effort between different stakeholders of the industry to make sure that we do not miss the purpose of protecting the players.
Thank you very much. This is a very timely statement. I will come back to AI maybe later in our discussion, but I first want to deep dive into the content of the topic. And if you read the title of this panel, you will find the words "Beyond Profit." And it's an amazing title for such a discussion, implementing the insights of the industry. And it reminds me to the discussion we had before with regulators, when we learned about the right balance between restrictions, regulation, and player protection. So I think, Robert, this could be a very interesting point for you, representing the industry here as well, of course. How do you see the right balance between individual freedom of players and social responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's a delicate balance. We know that problem gambling impacts a very small minority of consumers. We also know, and certainly as an operator, we know when we're engaging with customers that most customers want to decide their own limits. They don't like being told what to do. They feel that they are best placed to decide how they spend their own money. And ultimately, if people can't find the product or the choice that they want as a result of, let's say, highly interventionist policies, they'll find that choice elsewhere. And that was sort of spoke about earlier in terms of the unregulated market and the lack of protections that are available there. So any policy decisions, be it regulators, lawmakers, operators in deciding their own policies, they have to be grounded in evidence. Because if you don't know the right target audience, you don't know the right customer, you run the risk of having these unintended consequences where you're driving customers away from the regulated offering. So that means building evaluation in at the start and not taking the first bit of research that you get and then deciding that that is something that needs to be acted upon. It was just mentioned in the previous session that needs to be explored further, because you could very easily derive some high-level assumptions about what the data is telling you, and then that leads to, often sometimes with politics at play, public opinion at play, can lead to knee-jerk reactions, which then run the risk of not striking that balance. As long as you go through that process of that evidence evaluation and you get to the point where you're certain in the right policy action is whatever you take, then ultimately things like individual responsibility, personal freedoms have to be overstepped because the evidence is telling you that that's where you need to go. And as I said, sometimes I think, in Europe especially, politics and public perception, driven largely by media commentary on the industry, you'd be forgiven for thinking that really strong interventionist policies are needed, but time and time again we see that has unintended consequences, as you mentioned earlier with the problems in Germany around channelization. So it's a very delicate balance, and sometimes you need to ignore research and take preemptive action. But if you don't have that evidence and that research, then you run the risk of making decisions that are very difficult to row back on.
Evidence is a good point. I mean, Bet365 operates in so many various countries across the world, all over. From your corporate experience, what do you think are the key factors that drive players away from license offerings in particular?
Well, it's been mentioned before. I mean, naturally, one of the best ways of guiding people into the regulated market is through advertising and the ability to distinguish licensed operators from unlicensed operators, so people at least know that the brand that they're using is licensed and therefore contributing to the state finances, and they're afforded protections in the law. But by far, the most effective way of driving high channelization is through sufficiently liberal product offerings. And we've seen that across Europe, where if you effectively ban products through very low limits or strict affordability requirements like you have in Germany, or even just outright bans on products altogether, it just moves the problem elsewhere. The market still grows, but it doesn't grow in the regulated sector, and therefore all of the tax benefits that come with it.
So in one word, we can say it's about competitiveness of the product and of the companies. You mentioned Germany. As you know, that's where I'm from. I think we have two major issues, if not three. One is, of course, the product. If we talk about sports betting, the catalog of permitted bets is simply not competitive. Then we have limits, which is a one-size-fits-all limit, meaning the statutory deposit limit per player per month is 1,000 euro. You can exempt, you can apply for an extension as a player up to 10,000 euro for the first year, and finally up to 30,000 euro under certain circumstances. But there are many players who want and can afford to deposit more, and they're all gone, the high rollers, for instance. This is a problem. And thirdly, it's the tax rate. Our tax rate is 5.3 nominative tax from stakes, based on stakes. This applies to casino games as well. And that means that, in particular, the casino players are playing somewhere, maybe in Curacao, but only few of them maybe in Germany. Our estimate, if it's conservatively made, for the channelization rate is, I think, more than 50% is black market offerings in Germany. That's why I wanted to mention this. And it's about balance. And as you said, what's the solution? Jonas, I think there must be a dialogue between regulators and the industry. They both can, well, exchange knowledge and evidence. So regulators and operators have to work together and have to define measures for customer protection of minors against fraud. How can it work? How should it work?
Let me add to what you said. Some regulators make the mistake that by introducing very high tax rates, like in Germany that you mentioned, they think that they will protect the player. Plus, they will protect their income they generate from gaming. It's wrong. There is a balance because if the taxation is very high, this favors the black market. Why? Because they don't pay taxes, they give more bonuses, they attract players in different means. So that's something that has to be stressed. Eventually, as you mentioned very correctly, and I have to say that this is a general statement, in the next 10 years, I believe our industry will be facing a tighter scrutiny from governments and regulators, and we have to do our best in combination with the regulations, with the regulators and the governments to demonstrate as an industry holistically, not only online, land-based, casinos and everything, that we have effective measures to protecting underage. It's a big criticism. Second, vulnerable parts of society, the ones who are excessive gamblers and they cannot afford it, and then it leads them to addiction and other much more serious problems besides the financial ills. So I think that this is going to be key in the next 10 years. We have to demonstrate it. Second, responsible advertising. We have to be responsibly advertising our product and our brand, but not the profits. We should not be saying, come to our game because you will win millions or thousands or whatever. This is wrong, because this gives the wrong impression and people are motivated by it. So, and like I said, then the next thing which is very crucial, that's why I'm saying regulators and operators together, we need to find the fine balance. Excessive regulation leads to black market. You mentioned it. High channelization leads to the regulator having a good control of the players' habits and of the taxation income, which is very important for the government to implement programs that address the yields in excess of gaming, when gaming is practiced in excess. So I think it is very, very crucial, next 10 years. And I'm saying 10 years because in the previous 10 years, we didn't do as many. And this is crucial to reestablish the reputation of the industry as a very responsible and responsive to consumers' health.
Are you thinking about something like a responsible advertising code, like a code of conduct?
Yes.
Adjacent to the existing law or in combination with further developments?
In some countries we have proposed and we have worked together with regulators and they established an ordinance or a directive which says that you should advertise not, for example, at times when underage watch TV programs. This is up to 10 o'clock at night, or some countries they have imposed limitations up to 11 o'clock at night. They limit, like I said, the content. Don't advertise prices, advertise your brand and your product. So this type of codes, this type of rules, which I think most operators agree, responsible operators, and all people sitting here are representing very responsible operators, and this has to become a global trend. There are countries in Europe recently, I don't want to mention names, that they imposed very strict restrictions on advertising because it was overly done. They were advertising, besides the distribution of outlets in small cities and mainly casino outlets, which are, they appear to have been destructive. And now these governments prohibit the opening of this kind of establishments. in cities below 15,000 or 20,000 people. So, you know, in order to avoid this bad social reaction, because this is driven by social reaction, we need to self-control ourselves.
It's a matter of responsibility. Do we have to distinguish between online gaming and land-based?
Well, I mean, you know, this is in one industry, although our friends at the pub may think that we are different. It's, it's the same pool. Some people prefer to be in the retail shop because of the different concept. Some people like the convenience of the online. Some people like the entertainment of the big casinos. That's three different audiences. I don't have to say that they're strictly related, but this is one big industry. If you read in every country the statistics, I don't know if we can verify it with the example of Cyprus, 1% approximately of GDP is gaming, total gaming. Now, online is about 30 to 40%, growing. Why? Because of convenience, because of the younger generations, and that are entering in this type of, in our industry. But the other industries maintain because they offer a product which is attractive.
Yeah, Katerina, OPAP has done a lot to protect players, a lot of tools, measures. Could you share some with us, which are the best practices of OPAP, and include a statement on how you discuss advertising for gambling with us, please?
That gives me the opportunity to talk to you about an initiative that we recently took about affiliate marketing. You all know affiliates. They're marketing companies, marketing partners, promoting games and products and services of operators. In 2022, OPAP launched a responsible gaming campaign. The product was not payouts, was not services, it was responsible gaming. So the product to be advertised was that. It was a TV advertisement and also social media, etc. A very successful and very powerful campaign. And Stichiman, of course, has also a responsible gaming campaign targeted. What OPAP did was use the affiliate channels addressing to bettors, to people who seek for information, for tips in the gaming market. So they addressed to them to spread around the responsible gaming message. The results were impressive. There were millions of impressions. And not only they try to promote responsible gaming awareness, but also educate them by redirecting them to the responsible gaming websites, ask them to take a self-assessment test, and try to assist, let's say, the players on how to become more responsible, healthy, and sustainable in their gaming behavior. So that's how you combine a commercial communication, messaging, with responsible gaming, let's say, initiatives.
Thank you very much. I think we can conclude that one of the major goals of responsible gaming is to reach the player, because only if he plays in a regulated, supervised, protected environment, player protection can happen. If he plays outside, there's nothing. That's why these concepts are very important. But there are new concepts, developments as well. And probably, Robert, if we talk about new concepts in customer protection, such as affordability or single customer view, what do you think about
it? I think it comes back to some truths that I spoke about earlier, which was, you know, the problem gambling and financial harm associated with gambling. You know, I'd appreciate there was a session before this that talks about new emerging data, but historically it's shown to impact a small minority of consumers. We also know that, as I said, the vast majority of consumers don't like to be told what to do. And then the sort of third I'd add to that, particularly within sports betting, you have to remember that the relationship between the consumer and the operator is quite adversarial, in that the customer wants to beat the operator. That's the whole name of the game. I'll lay you a price and it's your job to back it and tell me I'm wrong. So the idea that a sports betting operator has the trust and the authority to essentially determine whether or not someone is gambling in an affordable way is a challenging concept. If someone goes to open to take out a credit card or get a loan, they understand that they're going to be scrutinized in terms of their finances. It's less acceptable in the gambling space. So we've got a long way to go to try and educate consumers as to the benefits of those kind of checks. The other thing is the economic progress of the industry, because we are talking about, typically when we talk about affordability, higher spending players, which in any e-commerce industry will make up a larger proportion of your revenues, and therefore the economic benefits that it has to the government. And also, I think, like it was really helpful the previous session, that assuming that anyone that gambles over a certain amount of money is at risk is wrong, and it also wrongly assumes that everyone who gambles below that level are not at risk. It's an incredibly complex problem, and I think what we're seeing with some of these emerging concepts like affordability, they tend to be driven by politics, they tend to be driven by public opinion, and often the proposals that are put forward I don't think are particularly well evidenced and have the risk of creating these unintended consequences. So the challenge, I think, with these kind of emerging technologies, and we've seen this transition in the UK in particular, is trying to find the best way of getting to the right customers with the right interventions. So if you take the UK as a classic example, many years ago when affordability was first sort of starting to come out as a concept, the idea was that customer spends X and they'll be subject to a quite strict affordability assessment. That has then evolved into a complete abandonment of the term affordability, and now we're talking about financial risk. So this is about identifying people who are vulnerable, who because of their circumstances are more susceptible to experiencing financial harm, and almost nothing really to do with the fact that they've spent or intend to spend more than X amount of pounds or euros. So I think it's a new concept. It's not really that well tried and tested. I could keep coming back to Germany, but Germany is an example where it's been embedded for a while, and look at the impact it's having there. So I think it's here to stay, and I think more and more regulators will be talking about these new concepts. But I think we need to learn and do that research up front, because once the horse has bolted, it's very difficult to change tack.
Yeah, and what about players, just with your company in so many jurisdictions, with your experience, if a player is gone, is there a chance to get him back, or is he lost forever just playing the black market?
Well, not even the black market. I think you see a lot more displacement across the industry. There are some jurisdictions you have literally hundreds of licensees, so the opportunity for choice is pretty unlimited even before you look at the unregulated market. It's difficult to know where they go, but what you can see is if the overall position of the market is reducing, that service is still going to be met somewhere, and the assumption would be that it's in the unregulated market. But certainly what we do know is that when customers are faced with these kind of interventionist approaches, particularly around requests for source of wealth and things like that, there are obviously scenarios where that absolutely has to happen. But by and large, people just don't want to comply, not because they've got something to hide. It comes back to that trust thing where it's a bit unusual for a gambling operator to be carrying out essentially an affordability assessment that you would expect your bank to do.
Right.
So I think it's an education piece, quite a long-term one, I think.
Yes, so I found it very interesting you said that, I would say, a relatively small portion of players stands for a high amount of gross gaming revenue. Can you give us some feeling like, what do you say, how many percent roughly would play less than 1,000 euros per month?
I don't really have that. I mean, in the UK, as an example, you know, the white paper was mentioned earlier. So the government had carried out its own assessments, and the levels at which they're considering these financial risk assessments, it's old data, it's maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but nonetheless it identified that, you know, over 40% of the revenue will be coming from these players. So the government recognised that whatever interventions you deliver, if any, for these consumers, has to be balanced, and it has to be frictionless, it has to be targeting the right consumers, and you have to work to the assumption that the majority of players who are gambling above those levels do not need any kind of intervention. They could just have a frictionless check. So that is the reality that I think we're facing. It's something that probably the industry doesn't talk about too much, but the reality is that higher spending players do make up a disproportionate amount of revenue, as with any e-commerce industry. So again, if you get that wrong, you run the risk of damaging the entire market unintentionally, but that's a very real risk.
Right. I think, Jonas, you listen very carefully, and so you agree with what Robert is saying. It was very interesting when you said that there is something too restrictive, like tax rates, which has a massive input on the market as well, which is our problem in Germany too. I think I remember in Italy some years ago, it's more than 10 years ago, maybe 2011, 12, something around this, the Italians realized that the channelization rate is very poor. Don't have the exact figure, maybe it's something around 30%. And then almost overnight, they changed the regulation in offering a more attractive scope of products, more bet types, and reducing the tax rate. And if I'm not mistaken, it went up to maybe something around 60%. I see this happen in my country, not in the near, but in the far future, hopefully. But from your perspective, the company you were chairing to as well, is only regulation the way to resolve these problems? And if so, can there be a dialogue? Can the industry give some impact on this sort of assessment of regulation? Would it perhaps be a good idea to create a working group, not only among regulators, international, but also among compliance officers, and probably both sides on one table, cross-border, once a year, somewhere? Could be a forum. Any ideas?
Well, I said it earlier. I think we're not alone in this. The regulators represent, the controlling part, the regulatory part. We have a very close idea of why and how the players act, because we see it. We're exposed to it. I have mentioned in this forum last year that the online gaming industry is the most transparent industry in the world. Everything that takes place in our server is channeled to the server of the regulator. They can see everything, customer activity, anonymous, but they can see player habits, they can see, we send them reports, but beside that, they can see everything. So why I'm saying this is because there is a huge fear about our industry, although it is the most transparent that I have seen. Tell me another example that every transaction is recorded at the same time with the controlling authority. Silence, just for everybody to think there is none.
Okay.
So what I'm saying, why do people go to the black market? Well, incentives. No taxation, hence the operator there offers higher bonus, because bonus is one part of this industry. And how do they keep the customer loyalty? This is one element. High taxation also on the player. Greece, where we're coming from, they impose very heavy taxation on the player winnings, but they get very high taxation already from the operators. So it's a hungry state that wants a lot of taxes. Half of the market, according to their study, to AGC, is black, online.
Right. So
and I don't know how much is that in retail. So what I'm saying is, this is what I mentioned. We need to balance this off, because channelization, like you mentioned, and Robert mentioned, is very important. 80% is the optimum, because there are some people in any country that they will not want to participate and declare their income, because we have the responsibility when we see some high activity to request source of funds. This is the AML requirement, and this is the European directive. Besides, every country in the world applies the AML controls. So besides RG, there are the AMLs, which is hand in hand. They go hand in hand. So this 20%, perhaps it's 15 in some countries, others perhaps it's 25, is those people, the highest takers, because it was mentioned that the majority of the income comes from a minority of players in the online gaming. I don't know how they measure it in OPAP, I forgot about it, but you can say. So in this regard, you have the obligation to check the player, and check the player if he's RG compliant and if he's AML compliant. And if he is not, then you have to report. And this is, I think, the key. But besides being a responsible operator, we need to discuss with the regulator, as we said before, what is the best way of achieving it. And high taxation is not.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent final saying. We can conclude. It's all about balance. And if the industry claims for more attractive products, it's beyond profit. It's not because of profit. It's necessary. And this is a balanced dialogue that must be continued. Our time is over. There are no questions. So again, I'd like to thank my panelists for their excellent contributions. Here.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yanis. Thank you very much. Thank you. For our next and last presentation of today's program, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Matthew Young, who is the Chief Research Officer at Greo Evidence Insights. As far as I'm informed, this will be a video broadcasting presentation. Am I right? I hope so.
That's correct.
Yes. Dr. Young, glad to have you with us. We can see you crystal clear and we can listen to you. And we are keen to learn from your experience. So feel free to fascinate the audience here in Cyprus. And thanks for joining us digitally.
Thank you for having me. My apologies, I can't be there in person. I was there last year and it was wonderful. This year it's not cooperating, but thank you. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about the low-risk gambling guidelines. I was able to listen in on the earlier presentations, and I was able to listen a bit to Professor Muggleton's presentation, and I think these presentations go very well together. I was very keen to hear a lot of the results that she presented. To begin with, I'll just put up a slide for my conflicts of interest declaration. We have no relationship and do not profit from the gambling industry in any way. So why was this project necessary? I think one of the things that really inspired us to work on this project was that we know gambling is a legal activity, but we also know it's not an ordinary commodity, kind of like corn or cotton. And it is more like alcohol or tobacco, or in Canada, we also, cannabis is legal. The reason it's similar to these products is that we know it's associated with risk, harm, and possible addiction. We also know that the messages that we use to provide people the RG messages are non-specific. So we say, only bet amounts you can afford to lose, take breaks on a regular basis, set yourself a time limit. But we've never actually quantified what those are. And so the utility of those messages has thus far been relatively limited. These are examples of lower risk drinking guidelines. This is something that's generally accepted within the public health space. They represent an evolution of thinking about alcohol. It used to be that we used to see alcohol as being the only harm associated with alcohol was an alcohol addiction. There's a huge amount of evidence now suggesting this is not the case. Alcohol is also responsible for injuries, accidents, violence. There's also a host of cancers of the digestive tract that are associated with alcohol consumption as well. And so, given that alcohol is a legally available commodity that's associated with harm, many countries have decided that it's really important to give the population some guidelines about how to consume the product, but also have reduce the risk of harm associated with that product. And there's a growing evidence base, like Dr. Muggleton presented earlier, suggesting that that gambling is very similar. So it's a product, many people enjoy it, but the only harm associated with it is not simply problem gambling. It's not simply, it doesn't affect a small number of people. It affects people across the population. So in comes this project, the Lower Risk Gambling Guidelines. So if you're interested, all the materials in this presentation are available at this website, and we can share that after the conference. So just a little bit of an overview of the project. So this was a 5-year international research project that took place between 2016 and 2021. There was oversight by a scientific working group. We conducted risk curve analyses of over 60,000 people who gamble from 8 different countries. We also included an online survey of Canadians and a focus group of over 50 people from across Canada who gambled. We also conducted 2 literature reviews that have been published, consulted widely, and collaborated extensively. So what are the guidelines? So we'll start with what we found at the end. So what we found through all this work, and I'll take you through a bit of the work in a second. To reduce your risk of experiencing harms from gambling, follow all 3 of these guidelines. So the first guideline is 1, how much? Gamble no more than 1% of household income before tax per month. And number 4, how often? Gamble no more than 4 days per month. And 2, how many? Avoid regularly gambling at more than 2 types of games. We also have included in this poster some information about what is meant by gambling types, and some information about the type of gambling, because what we found is the type of gambling you play really matters. Some forms of gambling lend themselves to more higher levels of gambling involvement, greater expenditure, and more frequent play. Included also on the poster is some safer gambling tips, as well as some information about what the consequences or harms are of gambling. So I'll give a couple of minutes about how they were developed, just so that you know that this was a rigorous process, and we did this well. So we essentially we published our research protocol before we engaged in this research. It was a 3-phase. The project was completed in 3 phases. First was quantitative risk curve analysis. This was followed by refinement and validation, and then we did a lot of knowledge mobilization or implementation. The first task that the research team had was to determine lower risk of what. And for this, we relied on a lot of the work that was done by Matt Brown, Erica Langham, and others in Australia. They had really talked about how gambling has the different types of harms associated with gambling. And then we measured them by using individual items from the problem gambling severity index. This is why some of the newer research coming out is so exciting, because replicating these, the risk curves I'm going to show you using actual behavioral data would be incredibly useful. Then we conducted risk curve analysis of over 60,000 people across the world. And this was a meeting of international experts we had in Montreal, Canada. These are the risk curve, the data sources we used. So we had data sources from Canada, from the United States, from Iceland, from Sweden, from Finland, from France, from Australia, and from New Zealand. When I talk about a risk curve, what do I mean? So what we did is we asked each of the participants each of the researchers who participated in the study to plot their data and to look at on the y-axis the percentage of their sample that reported the gambling harm we were interested in, and then on the x-axis talking about what their level of gambling involvement was, so days per month or expenditure or frequency. And so when we looked at gambling involvement, what we really did is we looked at what is how much did somebody spend gambling, how frequently did they gamble, and then how many types of gambling did they regularly engage in. And then we mapped that against the harms as measured by the PGSI items. And this is the table that you can find this listed in our report. I know I'm going through this rather quickly, but I also don't want to make everybody's head spin with research methodology. So basically what we found is this, is all of the research data sets, all 8 data sets that conducted these risk curves really found that the percentage of people experiencing harm really started to increase within a similar range. And so, for example, in frequency, what we found is that the percentage of people experiencing harm really started to increase, or the slope of the curve started to increase at between 5 to 8 days. We found these ranges across all the gambling involvement indicators. So we found that the percentage of the population reporting harm really started to increase as somebody spent between 1 to 3% of their gross monthly income, as they gambled anywhere between 5 to 8 days per month, and whether or not if they gambled 3 to 4 different types of games per month. So then what we did is we just went into a refinement stage where we said, okay, well, if we look at these ranges, what is the percentage of the sample report experiencing these harms within these ranges? So now I'm going to show you just a really complicated graph, or a chart. And what this really just shows you is, for example, we can see here that when we have financial harm, we can see that somebody that gambles more than 1% of their household income is 4.3 times more likely to report experiencing that harm than somebody who gambles at very, very low levels, which is at less than 0.1% of their annual household income. So what this allowed us to do is that these charts, we've produced many of these charts. These are all available in our reports. These charts allowed us to kind of look at what are some of the thresholds that really represent a higher risk of gambling-related harm. So then we moved into a refinement and validation phase. We commissioned 2 literature reviews to assess the effect of substance use on gambling behavior, as well as the factors associated with elevated risk of harm. We conducted an online survey of over 10,000 Canadians who gamble, and we conducted 5 interviews and 9 focus groups with people who gamble to determine whether or not they found some of the proposed thresholds valuable, useful, believable. So the results of this, all this work, turned out We produced many publications. These are available. I will just run through them here. We have one we conducted. So these are all available open access in scientific journals. And then after we released a lot of our scientific papers, other people have gone on to use the guidelines and publish other papers from them. So this is all the scientific work that has been done and been published from this project is available at the website that I showed you here at the beginning. So you can go and take a look if you're more interested. What I'm going to talk a little bit about now is some of the knowledge mobilization products, though, because in order for these guidelines to be useful, we really need to be able to have people who gamble hear about them so that they can potentially influence their gambling behavior. So the first one is the one that we started with, which is the poster that describes the different gambling guidelines. We also have other posters as well that are associated with it. So one is within our focus groups, we discovered that a lot of people didn't really understand what was meant by gambling harms. They kind of were of the perception that the only gambling harm was problem gambling. So what we did is we created a poster that described a little bit about what was meant by gambling harms. So for example, in this one, losing money is the gambling harm that first comes to mind, but gambling can lead to other harms like relationship conflicts, emotional distress, or health problems. Another poster that we produced was when gambling, what you play matters. So there are some gambling types of gambling that are at greater risk and some are at lesser risk. I think it's pretty obvious to most people who work in this field that somebody who buys the lottery ticket each week is at low risk of gambling-related harms, but whereas somebody who gambles online is at a significantly higher risk. And this is really related to just what is their level of involvement with gambling. So how much do they spend? How frequently do they play? We also included a poster that talked about how some people are more likely to experience harms from gambling. And so these are people who have experienced problems with anxiety or depression, experienced problems from alcohol, cannabis, or other drug use, or have a personal or family history of problems with gambling. Also available, so in order to run these studies, in order to promote the gambling guidelines, we did a campaign in Canada. We ran some banner ads on websites. These are some examples of some of the ads that we ran. Now, these ads are from people from a public health budget, so they're not going to be as slick as the ads that promote gambling, unfortunately. But they are nonetheless, they get at some of the ideas behind what the gambling guidelines recommend. Also available on the website, I showed you our LinkedIn, Twitter, images and things that can be shared. We also provided a tool on the website that uses the guidelines to provide personalized feedback to people who gamble. So this tool allows people to go online and input information about their gambling behavior, and based on the risk curves that we conducted in development of the guidelines, it provides some information about how much more at risk they are of experiencing harms than somebody who doesn't gamble very much. Use of the guidelines. So since they were developed, there's been quite a lot of engagement with the guidelines. So we certainly in Canada we have different regulatory authorities have used them and promoted them on their website. There has been some promotional activity at corner stores. In the United States, the Massachusetts Gaming Commission has adopted the guidelines and disseminates them as part of their GameSense program. They've been promoted in Australia and have been promoted in New Zealand. There's also colleagues at the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare are doing quite a lot of work in their country to validate the guidelines and look at how they might be adopted for Finns. And we are in conversation with others who have been working with the guidelines as well. So mindful of the time, my apologies for the whirlwind tour, but it's a lot to go through. It's a very, very large project that took place over 5 years, a lot of different components. I will stop there to see if there are any questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to give you a little bit of a quick whirlwind tour of the lower risk gambling guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Young. There's a question indeed, and I'm happy to quote this question, which is, why do you believe players turn to the black market? Regulators can't protect players who can easily be scammed. Can we suppose they are the problematic players?
So why do players turn to the black market? I mean, I worked in substance use epidemiology for about 20 years, and I don't see, the only difference between gambling, alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs is their legal status. And so why do people turn? People are interested in these substances, and so they seek them out wherever they can get them. There is even after alcohol prohibition ended, there was still a black market for a period of time. In Canada, cannabis prohibition ended, and there is still a small black market, which is disappearing, even though the cannabis market does not permit advertising. I think that people will seek out the black market for a large number of reasons. I'm not sure if it's unidimensional. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case.
Yeah, the second part of this question is, can we suppose they are the problematic players, so players leaving the regulated market? Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I can. I mean, if we look at cannabis in Canada, there are many people who are not necessarily problematic cannabis users, but will still access the black market for cannabis simply because those relationships have been established prior to legalization. And there's something about that relationship that they appreciate. So I don't know if it's simply a function of whether or not somebody has a clinically diagnosed addiction per se. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question, but I don't know the answer to that.
Right, this is it. So no more questions left. Thank you very much for your exciting and interesting presentation. All the best to you personally. And we hope we see you again in person next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is it for the educational part today. I'm going to close this conference, but it goes without saying, I have to say thank you very much to the NBA for organizing this conference so professionally. The whole in-house team, so many details have to be considered. Thank you very much, you did a great job. But also their partners, putting together everything that needs to be organized, caring about traveling, caring about an excellent audio, video quality, simultaneous translation service here for your well-being. So I think this deserves a big hand of applause, including for those I probably forgot to mention. Mind you, Slido does not only work to raise questions, it also works to deliver some comments. Did you like it? Did we meet your expectation? If you open the app and you move from Q&A next to polls, you will find a poll with very few questions. It takes maybe a minute to fill that out, and the organizers would be more than grateful if you take that time to give us some reaction, some response on today's event. Event is a good point because this is not the only event this week, this is just the start of it. So even in the Slido app, you can find the program of the whole week of all the events and seminars which are available and which are worth to be visited. With that, I finally thank all my co-speakers and, of course, everybody in the room, all the participants. Without you, that wouldn't be a conference. That's why I hope to see you again next year for the 8th Safer Gambling Conference and Week. Thank you very much for your attention. All the best.